We've never seen anything like this. The number one killer in the US for those under 50. Many were minor children. More dead each year than 3 wars that spanned 5 decades. It's everywhere. Stopping the crisis will require unity and leadership.
It's an honor to start a new series. Clearly, we're in a crisis, a global crisis, with respect to synthetic drugs, synthetic opioids, and more specifically, fentanyl. And when I began doing some fairly deep research, this woman named Vanda kept popping up last year. And so it's an honor for me to introduce Vanda, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, where she directs the initiative on non-state armed actors and the Brookings series on the fentanyl epidemic in North America and the global reach of synthetic opioids. She also directs a Brookings work stream on China's role in illegal economies and Chinese criminal groups across the world. What she shares today represents solely her personal views and does not reflect the views of Brookings, its other scholars, employees, officers, or trustees. And it's important to note that the Brookings Institution is a United States nonprofit organization devoted to independent research and policy solutions. Its mission is to conduct high-quality, independent research, and based on that research, to provide innovative, practical recommendations for policymakers and the public. And so, Vanda, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Paul, for having me, and thank you for having this conversation and work on fentanyl, which is a source of devastating public health crisis in North America, in the United States, and also a source of a national security crisis.
Vanda, tell me just a bit. I'm just curious about you. We've briefly met one time in DC, but tell me a bit about your background and what brought you to this work. I'm curious.
So, as you mentioned, Paul, I direct at Brookings several different work streams, one of which is the initiative of non-state armed actors. And really, my entire professional career over the past 20 years, I have worked in one way or another on non-state armed actors, be they insurgents, terrorists, or organized crime groups, and on illegal economies. And of course, at the epicenter of that work has been drugs, the illegal drug economy. It's not the only illicit economy I work on. I do a lot of work on wildlife trafficking and other illegal economies, but drugs has been very important. And over the span of my work, particularly in the past 5-6 years, a very dramatic change has taken place, with the world shifting away from plant-based drugs towards synthetic drugs, which in the United States, in Canada, and also in Mexico, although the Mexican government doesn't often disclose it, has been the shift to fentanyl, stimulating setting of unprecedented death rates related to drug use, something that the world hasn't seen before. The most lethal epidemic ever in history, even while it is still contained just to North America, even before it has spread elsewhere. So, I have worked in the space of non-state armed actors, illegal economies for a long time. I have been witnessing, of course, this change. And it's a change that affects many of us in a very personal way. What is so striking about opioids and fentanyl is that so many people are personally touched, personally harmed, having their relatives, their friends, people they know die as a result of fentanyl overdose.
Vanda, the word fentanyl, sometimes politicians use or influencers use the term brand ID. Everybody's heard this word fentanyl. And yet I continue to be amazed in my work, kind of in the field, that so many people really don't know what it is. So they've heard of it, but they might be old enough to say, yeah, I remember I had a friend die of heroin 30 years ago, or a friend overdosed on cocaine in the 1980s. This phrase, global shift from from crop-based to synthetic-based opioids, that's kind of the macro issue, and I wanted to focus this series or with you as much as possible on this global shift. Why is this global shift from crop-based to synthetic-based so dangerous?
Really. So let me explain what fentanyl is. You mentioned that
Yeah.
although communities are enormously hit, suffering, individuals, families are hit, many people still perhaps don't know what fentanyl is. So fentanyl is a synthetic opioid. It's in the fentanyl class of opioids. It was invented, synthesized back in the 1960s, and it's a drug that has tremendously important medical use. The man who synthesized fentanyl is a hero to palliative care medicine, is the hero to the oncology community, because fentanyl is so potent that patients living with terminal illnesses, excruciatingly painful terminal illnesses, such as cancers, all of a sudden have medication available that works. So oftentimes patients with terminal stages of cancer will become inured to morphine. Morphine no longer mitigates the pain. And so fentanyl is tremendously important for delivering care, for easing just the most excruciating aspects of dying. And it has wider uses in medicine. Many people who will have a surgery will have a fentanyl component of the surgery's component of the anesthesia. We have been going through the COVID pandemic. We often talk about it as if it were over. It's not over. More than 30 million people have died, and people continue to die and be infected today. But when people need to be hospitalized and be put on ventilators, they are often given fentanyl so that they can accept and tolerate having the life-saving ventilator. Now, so for several decades, you have fentanyl existing in the medical community, and often for a long time, you have really bad access to palliative care. Now, come the 1990s, you have companies like Purdue being the most significant one, which start saying, we now have palliative medicine, palliative medication that will redress this lack of palliative care across the populations beyond terminal cancer patients, beyond terminal illnesses, and that will not get people addicted. And this is, of course, prescription opioids like oxycodone. Now, Purdue and other companies, Purdue being the principal villain, are systematically lying that those drugs are not addictive and that 14-year-old can be taking them by the fistful for sprained ankle, and 80-year-old grandmothers can be taking them by bagfuls for arthritis. Now, those lies lead to vast numbers of people becoming addicted to opioids. Now, something significant happens in about a decade and a half ago. There are two big two big structural changes. One is that finally the United States medical profession wakes up to the fact that Purdue and others have been lying, and that thebaine, oxycodone, which is thebaine-based medications, are highly addictive. So this overprescription, this flood, this open spigot of the medical systems delivering oxycodone is shut off. And now people start searching for alternative drugs because so many people have become addicted. They now need these medications for their daily lives. They suffer from a chronic illness.
In what years are we all know about the pharmaceutical industry and the opioids, but roughly what year does it start to turn?
In the late 2000s, so around 2008, 2009, 2010 is where you have real wake up and realization just how many people now have a chronic opioid use disorder, and that this has been driven by oxycodone being shoved into people's mouths. So the spigot is turned off, but people have opioid use disorder. They start sourcing drugs. And at first they source heroin, which for the United States come from Mexico via Mexican cartels. But at around the same time is where the other change hits. And this is the change in the way fentanyl is produced. which is now greatly simplified. And the synthetic opioids that has been around for several decades and is so vital in medication can be produced in a much simpler way. And the fact that it can be produced in this much simpler way all of a sudden allows for many greater numbers of producers, legal, illegal cartels, to be producing fentanyl. And so fentanyl is great for enormous pain because it is super potent. And it's also highly addictive, but it is this potency that is the cause of this tremendous lethality. The fact that we have the most lethal drug epidemic ever in history, the synthetic opioids more generally, including the fentanyl class of opioids, simply make it very easy to overdose. Very small amounts can kill. And the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration phrase, one pill can kill. We can get beyond that. One small amount can kill. Now, today, beyond the fentanyl class drugs, we have other drugs that are emerging in Europe, other synthetic opioids like nitazines, which are as powerful, perhaps even more powerful, and carry the same enormous risks.
And you touched on something which I find interesting, again, in some field work, if you will, speaking with people that are addicted to fentanyl. And the way they describe, I've never seen anything like this, the way that these users of fentanyl describe the comparison of heroin or OxyContin, which was their former drug, to fentanyl. It's hard to even find words to convey the intensity and the level of conviction they have in saying that nothing comes close to how quickly this hits and how strong and wonderful it is, if you will. And I do think that gets lost a bit, perhaps, because again, people think people have taken heroin for a long time and people have used cannabis for a long time. But the way that many of the, this is anecdotal, but many of the people that use in my space describe fentanyl is for the equivalent of a cheap can of beer. Now today, I can have this high for 5 hours. It's bliss. Anyway, that's not a question, but it's more of an observation.
Let me come in on that. So the fact that synthetic opioids of the fentanyl class, nitazine class, are so potent has several effects. We spoke about the lethality. Very small amount can kill. And if the user doesn't know what is in the hit that she or he is taking, then death can result very quickly. But the other aspect of it is what you mentioned, and that is the fentanyl highs are very, very potent. That's function of the fact that these medications, these chemicals rather, are so potent. Now, there is another thing to fentanyl that is very specific. With that intensity of the high comes very rapid decrease of the high. So the length of time that the fentanyl high lasts is much smaller than what would be the case in heroin. So you could have long-term heroin users who would need to use once a day, maybe twice a day, and still lead quite normal life in some circumstances, not always. But because the fentanyl high is so intense, but because it comes off so quickly, people often need to use fentanyl 4 or 5 times a day to be maintaining that euphoria and to be mitigating the downs that come with coming off that high. Now, that has many consequences to it that go beyond lethality, beyond overdose. Well, number one is if you need to use 4 times, 5 times a day, you are playing the roulette of will this dose be the lethal one that will result in overdose 4 or 5 times as opposed to once or twice a day with cocaine or heroin. So that increases the chance of overdose. But it also makes it just so much harder to maintain normal life, be it life with the family or be it maintaining work, because the user has to be using so frequently. Now, when fentanyl emerged, it's not that users woke up one day and started saying, we want fentanyl. There is often a kind of mythology and simplification that you hear. But if only there were not demands, then there would not be supply. There would not be the drug trade. Well, in various cases, and certainly in the case of fentanyl, it is supply that creates demand. And specifically in the case of fentanyl, it was combination of Chinese chemical producers, Chinese smuggling networks that started supplying fentanyl from China in about 2013, 2014 to the United States. And soon the Mexican cartel, specifically the Sinaloa cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, jumped into that opportunity and started bringing in fentanyl and mixing fentanyl first into fake Oxycontin pills, into the heroin supply they were producing in Mexico, and eventually into other drugs. So today, you think you might be buying heroin or methamphetamine, the chances are very substantial that even with these stimulants, there will be a fentanyl component to it, which is what generates another risk of overdose because users do not know what they are getting. So the criminals, the criminal networks in China, the Mexican criminal networks went out specifically to create demand. And in fact, you hear in DEA, in Drug Enforcement Administration, wiretaps and indictments of the heads of the Sinaloa cartel, the so-called Chapitos. You hear these extraordinary statements in which they talk about the fact that they want to create streets of American junkies and being indifferent to how many people they kill in creating this new demand because they believe they'll get so many more people addicted. And we are seeing similar patterns in Mexico, where in northern Mexico, even though the Mexican government doesn't want to acknowledge it, but in places like Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez, the criminal groups have been mixing fentanyl into local drug supply. So there is probably a significant number of people suffering from fentanyl use disorder with much less awareness and much less care availability than even in the United States already in Mexico.
I want to touch on, thank you. I want to touch on this. Sometimes I use the metaphor of twin towers because on that horrific day, of course, you had one tower and another tower. And in this case, you have something, as far as I know, completely unheard of in the history of illegal narcotics going back as far as we could, which is people dying that aren't users, right? And we know all about these teenagers who thought they were experimenting on Snapchat and they buy a Percocet and it's laced. So there's a lot of confusion, amazingly, about this still. Will you go back to 2013, 2014, 2015? Like you said, these cartel groups saw a window of opportunity. You have the U.S. opioid addiction crisis from the pharmaceuticals perhaps slowing down, and they see this window of opportunity. With the addition of fentanyl laced into other pills. Can you just, again, state when that happened and what the intention was behind it? Because I still talk to people that say, I don't understand. Why would you add fentanyl to a Xanax? Aren't they just deliberately trying to kill the users?
So in 2013, 2014 is the situation where the U.S. policy, the U.S. medical community, the U.S. government had woken up to the fact that Oxycontin is highly addictive and that vast numbers of Americans are addicted, ever than we have seen before. In fact, here is a really important example of a badly regulated legal supply causing harm on a scale that an illegal market never could. We had, illegal market in heroin in the United States since the 60s and intensely so, or intensely so in relative terms, since the 1970s. And you never have those death rates. I mean, you have people suffering in many ways from both the use and the policies responding to the use, but you don't have this enormous lethality. And the numbers of people are pretty stable. The numbers of people addicted to heroin is for several decades stable. It's this legal market that is badly regulated, that is intensely promoted by the key pharmaceutical companies. Again, Purdue Pharma, the principal villain in the story, but other villains in the story, lying to everyone about these drugs, relieving pain without causing addiction. So by 2010, 2011, 2013, you end up with far greater numbers of Americans addicted to opioids than has ever been the case in US history. But at the same time, the legal supply is now turned off. You no longer can walk to a responsible doctor's office or responsible pharmacy and say, I have toothache, give me a fistful of oxycodone. And so people who are already at this point, however, suffering from opioid use disorder need to feed their habit. And so they start going to the legal market. The original legal market is heroin that comes from Mexico. The poppy plants are grown in central parts of Mexico. In Mexico, they're produced into heroin, and then criminal groups, Mexican cartels, start bringing it into the US. But Chinese criminal networks, Chinese legal producers notice that there is this gap in supply while there is vast demand. And fentanyl at the time is not regulated in China. The entire class of fentanyl type drugs is not regulated in China. There are no restrictions. And so various pharmaceutical chemical companies in Mexico, in China, rather small brokers and large brokers just start shipping it directly to the US, to drug dealers, retailers, sometimes directly customers via legal postal services.
So just to be clear, there are bad actors in China that are aware of the opioid crisis due to the pharmaceutical industry. They are aware that the U.S. is turning down the spigot, and they see a monetary opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And what is a bad actor, right? Because at the time you don't have fentanyl, the fentanyl class drugs. There are other versions of fentanyl, even more potent versions like carfentanil, various fentanyl analogs. None of these are at the time regulated in China. So it's criminal networks jumping in on the opportunity, but just many actors who operate legally, who operate the legal pharmaceutical companies, who operate legal chemical companies, brokers, mom and pop type of operations, all of which are saying Americans want opioids, let's send them all fentanyl. Now, the fentanyl starts causing big hikes in death rates. But meanwhile, while there is this supply from China, the Mexican cartels, Sinaloa and Jalisco, are saying, well, wait a minute, what's happening to our heroin supply? Why are the local suppliers, users, not buying our heroin? Why are they going for something else? What is this something else that's hitting the street? What is this super potent heroin-like thing? And they realize it's a supply from, it's fentanyl. And then they make the decision about 2015, 2016 to get in on the game. And perhaps there was an opportunity for US law enforcement to try to discourage the two cartels from going into synthetic drugs. Nonetheless, the reality is that the two cartels did go into fentanyl drugs, and they started massively supplying fentanyl across the United States in a wave that moved from the East Coast to the West Coast, and eventually mixing fentanyl into all kinds of other drugs. And it's not that the drug dealers, the chapitos, the heads of the Sinaloa cartel, want to kill their customer base off, but the wording in the Drug Enforcement Administration wiretaps is just so striking in them calculating it doesn't matter how many people we'll kill, we'll get many more people addicted. It's just striking indifference to human life, striking indifference to the power of law enforcement, which they have now realized that they should never have been that indifferent. We have seen significant U.S. actions, such as the arrest of Ovidio Guzman, one of the leaders of the Chapitas. And you also have them doing egregious things in very many ways in Mexico itself, including experimenting on their slaves, their victims, the people they're detained with the fentanyl badges. And so there are moments where they kill off the people with the fentanyl badge, that on whom it's a woman, on whom they're experimenting. And they realize that the fentanyl badge is too potent, that it's faulty. And then you have this conversation between them saying, oh, should we hold this badge because it's clearly too potent, it will kill people off. And they say, well, never mind, let's just send it anyway, even though the production costs are so low. So again, just utter indifference to human life, conditioned from the indifference to human life that they have in Mexico, where killings, torture, kidnappings, and disappearances of people, most of whom will never be found alive again, are just daily occurrence at scales that are shocking and devastating for the country. So as we suffer from the fentanyl overdose death rates, and Mexico is starting to suffer from those as well, Mexico is also dealing just with enormous criminal violence and homicide levels.
So to summarize that, there was a massive new business opportunity for the two major cartels that they started seeing as a result, to a certain degree, of negligence in this nation with respect to these pharmaceutical companies such as Purdue.
Oh, more than negligence. I mean, just
catastrophic
policy, catastrophic policy failure for about a decade and a half before policy started being corrected.
So, in my relatively short amount of time in this space compared to yours, I've heard a few times what I deem to be kind of silver lining solutions to this crisis, from very aggressive harm reduction types of measures that we might see in places like San Francisco or Oregon or Vancouver, to use of psychedelics, to bombing labs in Mexico. I've heard some of that from some presidential candidates. In any case, though there are certainly foreign bad actors, without any question, in communist China and in Mexico, the U.S. does play a role. And most specifically, we have a massive substance abuse issue in this nation, mental health crisis, some would say, lack of access to affordable mental health services. And more specifically, the majority of smugglers and dealers are U.S. citizens. So, you talked about this earlier, and it was going to be my question. And I heard this from an author who I'm sure that that in one of his books, Sam Quinones said that he believed supply reduction to be the best form of harm reduction, which to me is a very jolting kind of statement. Because of course, there's just this question of, is it supply or is it demand? If we could just lower demand, the supply would go away. And I know you don't have an easy answer to this, but I'm very curious about what you think about this topic.
Well, look, demand reduction is critical, but we really need to unpack what we mean by demand reduction and what are realistic objectives. So you often hear in supply and transshipment countries, well, if only you gringos, if only you Americans weren't snorting coke and weren't using fentanyl and prior to that oxy, we wouldn't have problems. We wouldn't have problems with violence. Well, not so easy in multiple ways. Countries around the world are experiencing expansion of drug use. Countries like Argentina, Brazil, Peru, that for a long time were either not experiencing significant drug use or merely supply countries, now have developed significant habit. Brazil and Argentina probably have cocaine use on per capita with the United States, and perhaps even greater, because our cocaine market has significantly declined and is essentially kept alive by fentanyl being mixed into cocaine. Traffickers around the world are constantly doing what they did in the US. They are creating new markets. So you see the Sinaloa cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación introducing methamphetamine into European markets. In Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, Britain, Bulgaria, Belgium, Germany, other countries that for decades were principally using heroin or cocaine and did not have methamphetamine use. And people are going to drugs because of the issues that you mentioned. They are traumatized, whether it's people in the Middle East by the 2 decades of wars and trauma from Syria to Iraq, economic suffering and meltdown in Lebanon, the number of refugee people. So around the world, we are seeing significant expansion of drug use. We're also seeing particularly significant and really dangerous switch from plant-based drugs to synthetic drugs. So addressing demand is really, really important. It needs to be at the core of strategies. But it's a fantasy to think that we will get from current levels of demand to say 20% of that or 10% of that, maybe even half. Rather, how we need to think about demand is enabling access to treatment to stabilize people's life, to allow them to function while they have a chronic illness, which is substance use disorder, and ideally, in as many cases as possible, which will not be possible for everyone, to get them to stop using, because people can have more or less normal lives with continual drug use, but they also face significant challenges, be they social, economic, and health ones. So not using drugs is much better than using drugs, and using drugs with support, with access to medical treatment is much better than using drugs without those. So a lot of demand reduction is about enabling people to have access to medical care, enabling people to have access to medication. This is particularly true about opioids, where you have medication that people can take instead of the more dangerous substance. So it can be buprenorphine to be mitigating the cravings and the physical and psychological needs to use. It could be methadone in some countries. There is even legal supply of heroin. British Columbia, that you mentioned, Vancouver has legal supply of opioids for people who are addicted, who suffer from chronic substance use disorder. Those are some of the components of demand reduction. But demand reduction is also about not allowing another replication of pharmaceutical companies creating more demand. It's about expanding access to insurance, whether it's like Obamacare did, significantly expanded access to medical coverage, insurance coverage for a variety of substance use treatment, be it medications, be it psychological support, but far more of that needs to be. And we're still in a place in the United States where maybe 30% of people with opioid use disorder have some sort of evidence-based treatment. And I say some sort, it might not be full evidence-based treatment. So in many countries around the world, including countries that are newly developing substance use challenges, will have much less access to treatment. You have other countries like Portugal, where because of universal health care, because of the way health services are supported, the coverage is much larger. But the fact that we need to concentrate on demand reduction, that we need to promote harm reduction measures that save people's lives, like access to clean needles, like safe consumption sites where people can have ready access to overdose medication, doesn't mean that we need to give up, that we should give up on supply. There have been many mistakes over many decades in how we conduct supply measures, and we need to avoid those mistakes, be it crop eradication, although that's not an issue with fentanyl, or be it policy targeting approaches that are ineffective or counterproductive, like high-value targeting of drug capos without dismantling the middle level underneath. But we shouldn't just say, let's just give up on supply and have, instead of 100 kilos of fentanyl coming in daily, I'm making up the number just as an example, we'll just live with 300 kilos coming in.
Yeah. Our charter from some very respectable board members and advisory board members focuses on a comprehensive solution. I've spoken with you about that before, not focusing on this dualism. It's a supply problem. No, it's a demand problem. But with that, we do have this kind of this linear sequence beginning right now in China with chemicals, maybe India to a certain extent, but from China to Mexico, smuggled through the border, dealers than to users. And I want to just focus for a bit, and I know you've done a lot of work with China. Of course, China has a form of government where it would seem relatively easy for Xi Jinping to put the hammer down. Where are we right now? I know there were negotiations with the former administration. There were negotiations with the Biden administration. Where are we today on that relationship with China with respect to the precursor chemicals?
So we are in a much better moment than we were before November of last year. There is cooperation from China. That cooperation is nowhere as intense as cooperation with United Kingdom or our European NATO partners or Canada. But there is some cooperation, which is good because for several years we had zero cooperation. But let me explain what this means in details. So first of all, after several administrations negotiating with China in 2018, China promised, and in May 1st, 2019, China implemented the scheduling of the entire class of fentanyl type drugs. Now, what does scheduling mean? It doesn't mean the ban. You want fentanyl in the legal surgery. Scheduling means that the production, sales, exports are all monitored, and imports for that matter are all monitored. They need to be all licensed. They need to be all disclosed. This was a big ask from the US government, and after several years across several administrations of negotiations, China did that. And when China did it, the supply switched to precursor chemicals, which are the basic ingredients from which fentanyl is produced, and started shipping them to the Mexican cartels.
So just to be clear, prior to this 2019 scheduling, China was more commonly sending finished fentanyl to the U.S.
Yeah, so prior to May 2019, China was sending actors in China were sending finished fentanyl to the United States. They were also sending finished fentanyl to Mexican cartels. And after the scheduling takes place, some finished fentanyl is still moving, but it declined significantly. And instead, the dealers in China will be sending the ingredients to Mexican cartels from which to produce fentanyl. Now, many of these ingredients are very basic chemicals. They have enormous legal uses. They are, very core basic chemicals for agriculture, for chemistry. And so there is very little likelihood that they would be scheduled. They would be subject to the same regulations and restrictions that finished fentanyl is. And for several years, then, China has used this as an excuse not to crack down on the supply out of these chemicals, even to Mexican cartels, with the explicit knowledge that the dealers had that they were sending the chemicals to criminal groups. I mean, they would be sending this through the dark web. They would be accompanying the chemicals with chemicals for other illicit drugs, precursors for cocaine, fillers for cocaine, and recipes of here is how you take these legal chemicals and convert them into fentanyl. And by the way, we know how to evade Mexican customs, for example, so they don't catch those drugs. But China said, yeah, that's all very nice. These chemicals are legal, they're not scheduled, we cannot act against them. So, tensions build up in the relationship, but they build up beyond simply the drug sphere. And when China scheduled the fentanyl class drugs in 2019, it did it with an expectations of an explicit quid pro quo. It specifically hoped that this would lead to significant improvements of the overall bilateral relationship, and that the Trump administration at the time would reduce the economic tariffs it has imposed on China. Now, the Trump administration didn't do it. So China waited for what would happen in the elections. The Biden administrations come in, and there is a period of time where China is looking to the U.S., okay, will you now deliver on reducing the economic tariffs? And the Biden administration doesn't do it. And in fact, the Biden administration ramps up strategic competition across the military sphere, alliances, technology, economy, in a way that we haven't seen. And although we don't use the term Cold War, as the certainly the Biden administration, the US government doesn't use the term Cold War. Many people, many officials in China would say, okay, we're in a Cold War with the US. And as this is happening, as China is not getting the payoff, the strategic payoff that it expected it would have, it goes, it reduces cooperation to less and less. And by kind of late 2021, early 2022, we essentially have no cooperation. China is not acting against the precursors. China is not dismantling networks. It's not providing intelligence to the US. It's not acting on US intelligence against criminal networks that are operating on the dark web, Chinese actors that are selling precursors to Mexican cartels, not against Chinese money launderers.
Yeah.
And then fully suspends cooperation. So, let me just say where we are today. So after intense negotiations in November of last year, President Xi agrees to restart cooperation. And we have seen several components to the cooperation restarting. That is the creation of a joint China-US commission on narcotics that's specifically focusing on fentanyl. For the first time ever, China promised, or for the first time ever in a systematic way, China promises to cooperate with the US on money laundering involving Chinese actors. The Bank of China has been one of the significant places through which fentanyl money is laundered, including by Mexican cartels. China also starts taking US intelligence and is sharing US intelligence back. Now, there are still big outstanding issues in the relationship. One is what kind of paybacks China expects, and there are several, and it might not get any. And if it doesn't, will that mean that it will just turn off the cooperation again? The US wants China to implement Know Your Customer regulations that would get around this problem that China says these companies are legal, they're selling legal products, and they're selling them to illegal actors, but it doesn't matter. And of course, they'll say, well, we don't know that we're selling to illegal actors. How are we to know that we're selling to Mexican cartels? Well, the answer is that in the US, you have Know Your Customer regulations for, as best practices, sometimes legally mandated in the financial sector, and you cannot just rely on that excuse. And finally, it remains to be seen whether China will mount any prosecutions, arrest any individuals from the networks that are cooperating with global criminal organizations. China still keeps saying, no, we won't be able to do that. So in the kind of zero cooperation that we had between 2022 and November 2023, and kind of 10, the ideal cooperation, we may be at 3 or 4. And for how long yet remains to be seen.
And this is a loaded question, but you said it. China is using this issue to leverage against other issues that would work to their national interests, such as tariffs being one.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is in fact how China more broadly views extension of law enforcement cooperation, not just vis-a-vis the United States. China uses law enforcement cooperation to foster relationships, to build influence, often far more extensively than countries that are buying Chinese law enforcement cooperation realize. It rewards countries with whom it has good relationship with law enforcement cooperations, and countries with whom it has tense relations or with whom the relationship deteriorates, it denies law enforcement cooperation. So the Biden administration hope they can ramp up the strategic competition with China overall and then put several issues aside, like climate, like fentanyl and drugs, like AI, and say, so we'll compete overall, but we'll cooperate on these issues. And China said, oh no, that's not how it works. You want to cooperate on these issues, we need to get improvements in the strategic relationship. And this basic differences in the basic formula, in the core diplomatic political calculation remains, despite the fact that we now have cooperation. But I would also say that we have had President Xi strongly committed himself to cooperation. We have had statements from a set of highly influential powerful Chinese officials saying they're committed to cooperating on fentanyl. And so we certainly need to take advantage of this window of opportunity for however long it lasts.
Wow, it's just fascinating to have it reiterated that fentanyl is amongst a few bargaining chips being used between their relationships with the U.S. So we have China. I am going to ask you a question about weapons of mass destruction categorization, but before then, that was very thorough. Let's jump now to a new president elect, I believe, in Mexico, and this thorny problem of the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco Nuevo Generacion cartels. What can we do there? What's the status of that? It's kind of the same question. Our current conversations with Mexico, and I think I know what you're going to say, but I'm curious.
Well, look, China and Mexico have been the principal sources of supply of fentanyl to the United States and fentanyl more broadly. Yet we have had really inadequate cooperation with both countries. Just as the cooperation went to zero between U.S. and China over the past several years, so it has with the López Obrador administration, so the administration of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who has been the president in Mexico for the past 6 years. His term finishes in the fall of this year, and the new person, Claudia Sheinbaum, who comes from his party, who has been a close supporter and collaborator with López Obrador, is the woman who has been elected the president of Mexico and assumes office in October. So during the López Obrador administration, we saw massive reduction in the extent of U.S.-Mexico cooperation on drugs and U.S.-Mexico cooperation in going after crime. What is happening with the Sinaloa cartels, Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generacion, the two most powerful criminal groups in Mexico, amidst very many other smaller criminal groups, is not just supply of drugs to the gringos. It's not just supply of drugs to us. It's supplies of drugs to people in Mexico who are suffering and dying. And it's these two large organizations and other criminal groups eating Mexico alive. They are taking over not just all manner of illegal economies in Mexico, they're taking over legal economies. They're dominating resource extractions from logging to mining, water distribution, legal water distribution in Mexico, or usurped water distributions, if you would like. They are taking over territories, people, legal institutions, their level of infiltration into daily life of people that dominate legal political offices. They often dictate terms to officials at municipal and state level is unprecedented. Mexico is being eaten alive by the narcos. And yet, as this has, and they played an enormous role in the elections, both in killing candidates they didn't like on behalf of the politicians for whom they worked, or sometimes they would field and promote their old politicians. And they also directed communities to vote in a specific way. So they are stealing elections in Mexico as they are stealing the rest of the country. Now, what has happened over the past 5.5, 6 years with the López Obrador administration was just a complete pullback from any kind of law enforcement action against them. Very occasionally, we would have sporadic action, sometimes instigated by the US, such as the arrest of Ovidio Guzman that I was speaking about. But overall, the thrust was that there was no action really meaningfully, systematically taken against the criminal groups. And why has Mexico been able to get away with it? Because in the United States, politics is dominating by migration. And migration has been hammered and catapulted to the top of the political discourse about our southern neighbor. It consequently has been dominating all issues in the US-Mexico relationship. And for the Trump administration taught Mexico that as long as Mexico turns on and off the spigot of migration and turns it off under US pressure and hosts migrants that the US wants to deport, including from third countries, it can get away with all kinds of problematic behavior. whether it's militarization of public policy, significant reduction in democracy, or really inadequate action against criminal groups that are destroying democracy and sovereignty in Mexico. So there's a new president. We are yet to learn about her security policies. She has mentioned some aspects. Some aspects of the security policies are very much continuation of the López Obrador administrations. Others might perhaps be deviating. A set of U.S. government delegations have gone to meet with her team. I think there is an opportunity to reset the relationship, to have a conversation that says acting against the big cartels, acting against criminal groups is not just good for saving lives from drug overdose on both sides of the border, but is essential for saving democracy and the state in Mexico and freedoms of people to be governed by elected officials and not by criminals. So we are yet to see how much that conversation will result in much better policies than we have had, and whether the US government can escape from the news of migration strangling other aspects of policies and other vital interests of the two countries. And it's changing foreign policies, including of a country like the United States that for several decades has principally focused on the Andes as a source of the drugs that Americans were using in its foreign policy. And now those countries don't matter for our supply very much anymore. Yet the criminal violence taking place there is enormous. And the two countries that we are dealing with as the strategic rival, China, and the country that we are looking forward to develop strategic partnership, India, are now some of the big challenges in terms of drug supply. So the global synthetic drugs revolution has very many aspects, has enormous risks for users, enormous public risks, and is profoundly reshaping criminal markets, national security policies, and foreign policies. And much more of that we will see. So one of the goals of the Fentanyl project and synthetic opioids project I run at Brookings is to provide as many examples, as many lessons for the world to avoid, to prevent the most devastating lethality, the most devastating challenges.
Well, it doesn't seem to be an overstatement that these are the very early days of what seems to be a complete shift. And I'm really grateful for your, really cutting edge work. It's going to take thought leaders like yourself and a lot of unity. One of the things I keep running into we've been, it's a soft launch, United Against Fentanyl, but this kind of either or thinking, supply or demand, or use of countries, it's China or it's Mexico, but it's more complex than just, a nation called China or a nation called Mexico. These things are all very complex, Vanda, and I think you do a phenomenal job, although you don't offer silver bullets. And so we're very grateful for the work that you do. You help inform our charter and the way we think about things. And so thank you so much for being our first guest on the Leader series with United Against Fentanyl.
No, thank you, Paul, for having me. And thank you for looking at this issue. It is a massive public health crisis. It's a national security crisis. And we need to come together as a nation in the same way that we have come to deal with COVID, to deal with fentanyl. So thank you so much for having me.
We appreciate it. Thank you.